So hello and welcome again, Dr. Vlad Dubaj and myself, Joyce Bok. We will be talking about our paranormal investigations of 3 haunted places in Melbourne, Victoria. I work as a psychologist and I have a keen interest in the paranormal, having some paranormal experiences myself. I'll just quickly describe one experience I had as a teenager. When I was 16 years old, I lived in a boarding house. I went to a boarding school and there were about 8 girls to a dorm. And this boarding house was an old orphanage. It used to be an orphanage, and I'm sure it's haunted because especially a certain passageway where you have to go to the toilet, you really felt like there's someone following you, and this coldness. And yeah, I remember I used to hold on so I didn't have to go to the toilet at night. But anyway, one night I woke up in the middle of the night and I saw this apparition which looks a bit like a flower suspended in the air. And there was a radio. The girl sleeping opposite me, her radio kept going on and off. So the music would be going da da da, and I yelled out to the girl, Tara. I said, Tara, can you please switch off your radio? I can't sleep. And she didn't say anything, and I looked over and she was fast asleep. So I got out of bed and I went to her radio and I saw that it was on radio. So I turned from radio to tape, for those of you who are old enough to know what a tape deck is. But then the music kept going. I jumped back, and it kept going and then stopped, kept going, stopped. So then I turned the volume down to 0. And I guess I never thought much about it. I thought, oh, maybe her radio was just playing up. And then I didn't hear anything after that. So I went back to bed. The next morning, I said to Tara, did you know that your radio was playing on and off last night? And she said, but that's impossible. There's no batteries in it. So that was one of the paranormal experiences I've had. And then when I went to live in Melbourne, I saw an ad for Rob Tilley's course in ghost busting or ghost clearing. So I attended Rob's course, and it was a very practical course. We went to a school, and the teachers there who worked back late would describe hearing footsteps or feeling that someone was following them. And also there was a room at the back where the teachers would hear jazz music playing sometimes and the blinds going up and down. Now, being a psychologist, I feel feelings, like other people's feelings, probably a lot more than the other sensories in terms of extrasensory perception. Yeah, so when I walked into that school, it felt very depressing to me. And that room at the back where the music was coming from, I didn't want to go in there. It just felt really unfriendly. I felt averse to it and felt depressing and quite hostile. After Rob cleared the place, I noticed a huge difference. The room felt friendly. I wanted to go in there, and it was just a stark difference. So after that, I joined the AIPR and I went to their conferences, and then I decided in 2019, I organised a conference called the Ghostbusters of Australia. I had Vlad on as a speaker. We actually had Andrea Perrin on as well via Zoom. The movie The Conjuring, if you've seen it, a horror movie, that was loosely based on her and her family's experience. And that was an amazing talk and amazing conference. And so Vlad and I would have a group prior to that conference, and we would investigate a place as part of that conference. So we've done 3 together so far. Yeah, so that's my introduction. I'll let Vlad speak.
So in terms of my background, I think my interest is kind of stems from when I was perhaps a teenager. I came across the concept of out-of-body experiences. I read Robert Monroe's books. I became fascinated with the idea of consciousness being able to survive outside of the body. And I think that's kind of what really spurred me on to go and essentially do a degree in physiology, neurophysiology, and then my PhD, and kind of continued looking into the paranormal, particularly out-of-body experiences, ghost activity, and anything to do with survival of consciousness. Yeah. Other than that, it wasn't particularly exciting. I didn't have any groundbreaking moments where I had paranormal activity occurring to myself. I kind of started more from an intellectual perspective, and now I realized as I progressed with my research that you can't just keep it intellectual. It's a strange thing, but you can't just look at it purely intellectually. You need to go deeper to a certain extent before you actually start experiencing these things. And I think these 3 locations that we investigated, the second one in particular, I think is one of the critical things where the pieces of the puzzle kind of clicked for me, where you have that intellectual versus spiritual kind of connection.
Yeah, so before the investigation, I would go to the place and I would talk to the staff members. And sometimes I find that when I ask them if we can do a paranormal investigation, they're a little bit resistant or reluctant, and they ask you, I don't want you to get rid of the ghosts. And it's quite interesting. It seems like that they like the ghosts to be there, and it's almost like they've had a friendship or a relation. I don't know. They like the ghosts to be there, and they're worried that we're going to get rid of the ghosts. And I would reassure them, no, if that ghosts do not want to go, we don't force them. It's their choice. And yeah, so definitely we don't force anything. But anyway, I asked them if they've heard anything or see anything, and usually they have. And they'll tell us, some staff, not all staff, will tell us about paranormal experiences they've had at that place. And we like to keep it small, so maybe no more than 12. I find that more than 12 people, it starts to get less intimate and everyone is everywhere. So it's nice to have a small group. And it's essential, I think, to have at least one psychic medium. Maybe more is better. And so because then they can compare notes. And yeah, we were lucky to have neuroscientist Vlad, and he's also an experienced paranormal investigator, and really suggest to arrive early to set up the cameras and the trigger objects. I think, and Vlad will talk more about the trigger objects.
Oh, right, okay. One thing that I'm not sure how much background I should provide. Most of my research when I was doing these site investigations or field investigations, I've always been inclined to keep it very, very controlled. So we would have no guests, no visitors. It would just be a core group of researchers who are fairly well trained in terms of data acquisition and monitoring the environment. Mainly because as soon as you invite guests and so on, there's going to be a lot more emotional responses and things. So for most of my research, it's been highly controlled, monitored, data logging of equipment and so on. So these 3 locations that Joyce and I investigated was done as part of essentially a ghost tour. We had guests, participants come in, I believe 12. Was it more than 12 on occasion?
Sometimes we had 16. Yeah, that became a bit
and so in that regard, I find I wasn't particularly comfortable with the idea because it's not under controlled conditions. But as it turns out, that's got its own advantages, as we'll find out later. But in general, if I'm setting up for investigation, I would turn up very early, look at the location, look for possible explanations of things like cold spots, could be due to broken windows or cold drafts coming through. Look at the walls and the floor and the ceiling with magnetic field detectors to see if there's any bad wiring in the house. Just essentially analyze the location to get a sense of what could possibly be a source of any anomalies that we could encounter during the investigation. Then we would set up equipment in various locations. So we'd have things like video cameras, magnetic field data loggers, infrared thermal imaging cameras, microphones, temperature sensors, all those kinds of things that you could imagine, which will allow us to data log as much of the energy spectrum as possible throughout the location. Can I jump to the next slide?
Yes.
One of the things, probably one of the most common bits of equipment that you might be familiar with if you've done ghost investigations would be the magnetic field sensors, EMF meters and so on. There are a couple of examples here on the screen. And the one thing you should also keep in mind when you're doing ghost investigations is that there is no piece of equipment that is designed to detect a ghost. So these are not technically ghost detectors. What these are, magnetic field meters, they're actually designed, in this case, to pick up the electrical activity, wiring in the house, for example. Okay, so these meters are specifically designed to pick up various frequencies, and they're there to essentially help you figure out if the wiring in the house is safe. If it's too strong, then you shouldn't sit next to the walls for too long. Okay, so you can move those around the place. However, lots of equipment has been designed. Lots of equipment can be used in a ghost investigation, which could register some sort of anomalous activity. And so people are using lots and lots of different types of equipment as ghost detectors. Joyce, am I running too far ahead of you, or can I keep?
No, keep going.
All right. So the idea behind doing an investigation with lots of different types of equipment is that we technically don't know what a ghost is. We don't know what haunting activity is. All we know is that certain things happen in a house, that people give it the label of ghost, or give it the label of haunting. And because we don't really know very much about it, the idea is we use as much equipment as we can to gauge as much of the electromagnetic spectrum as possible. And as I think Brian in his talk was talking about EMF, magnetic field fluctuations. That's probably one really nice example. Everyone's looking for magnetic field fluctuations. And so what this picture here shows is, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor. Okay, laser point. What you can see here, this kind of sinusoidal wave pattern here represents essentially the energy spectrum that as we currently understand it in terms of physics. The longer waves here are essentially weaker parts of the electromagnetic field. And as the intensity, the strength of it goes up, the frequency gets higher and higher. Okay. When we start off very low, this might correspond to things like very, very weak magnetic fields, like the wiring in your walls, operating at 50, 60 hertz. It could be things like radio and television broadcasts. Then as you increase the frequency and the strength of this wave, you end up going into the microwave range and the range where your mobile phones operate. You go even further and you finally go into infrared, which is body heat, for example, people's body heat. You can get infrared cameras for that. You get even higher, you go into the visible spectrum. So we can see color with our eyes. You go even higher into the ultraviolet. That's when you start getting really high energy stuff that will cause sunburn. Okay, we're getting into the ionizing kind of radiation, which can knock electrons off atoms and things, and that's long term. That can be detrimental. Okay, you get even further, and you get in X-rays, and finally in gamma rays. So we've got this very broad energy spectrum, and the idea is, well, ghosts could, in theory, when they pop up in your environment, they could be interacting or they could be manifesting energy in any part of that spectrum. We're not entirely sure. So people will look at magnetic fields. People have seen them, so clearly they somehow interact in the visible spectrum. They definitely interact in the magnetic field spectrum, possibly in infrared spectrum, could be in ultraviolet, we don't know. I've heard people who've also used Geiger counters and detected anomalies. So potentially ghosts somehow could interact in the gamma ray, portion of the spectrum. So potentially ghosts could interact with any particular frequency within that. And so the logic is, well, let's just saturate the environment with different equipment. And so if something does occur, we can get a gauge of where or how it might interact with the physical environment. All right.
So first, before we do the investigation, we would sit everyone around and do a protection. And I think it puts some people at ease that they will be, I guess, not going to be taking any ghosts back to them, even though research shows a different story. But anyway, we do a protection meditation. Usually it's like a white light protecting you, and also to allow them to tune in and become more sensitive to their sensory perception. So how they feel, what their skin feels, and the room, and any images, just to get them settled and relaxed. We also emphasize that it can be dangerous, because I have heard many stories from people who, especially playing with Ouija boards, they do experience very, horrible attacks, whether they imagined it or whether it's coming from external, but it is pretty intense. So we do emphasize we don't recommend using Ouija boards. And then what else do we do? At the end of the investigation, we would again do a meditation, and sometimes we have a smudge stick and do an aura cleanse, and just to get people to focus on discarding any attachments, and to when they go home, that they just leave by themselves and not take any entities with them. Our first place that we investigated is the Milano's Tavern. It used to be called the Brighton Beach Hotel. It was built in the 1840s. It was called the Royal Terminus Hotel, and it was one of the first hotels built in Victoria. So it's a very historical site. It attracted people who wanted to come to the seaside and get some rest and recreation. As you can see on the photo, there were 5 sitting rooms where you can sit and have tea, and 7 bedrooms, and you can stay there for 30 shillings a week. Some bush rangers stayed there as well. So Milano's Tavern. When I went there, I talked to some of the staff, and they said that after a certain time at night, they don't like going upstairs because they do hear things and they get very frightened. So, but it's a tavern. So downstairs there's a restaurant, and upstairs there are function rooms. And it just coincidentally, there was a wake that was occurring before our investigation. We had, Rob was there. Rob Tilley was there, and we had a few psychics there. There was one room in that place, I think it was a linen room, where when I walked into it, I felt like my breathing was constricted, and I felt my chest was being pressed down, and other people said they felt the same. It was very hard to breathe in that room. One guy walked in there, and I saw him just fall back and walk backwards outside of the room. And he said that he felt a hand push his forehead back, and it seemed like whatever was in there did not like males. We thought the psychics picked up that there was a young girl there who was raped, unfortunately, and murdered. And she was very, very angry, and she was especially towards males. Quite a few of the psychics said they saw a man with a mustache and a hat, and he was also very angry and didn't want us there. Rob had a different experience. He said he saw a lot of happiness, men with cigars, just having a good time. So there's picking up on different people in different periods. And there was a room, there was an attic as well, but we weren't really permitted to go up there, but some people did. And I think that room was it felt very haunted, like it felt quite nefarious. And I know that there was another investigation group who went up there, and they recorded a very soft voice saying, "Get out, get out." Yeah, you can see it you can find it on the internet if you want to. So that was our experience, my experience there, Vlad.
I think for me, I was mostly observing the other people throughout the night, and also there were quite a few mediums who were going through the place. And I think, as you mentioned, the main dining area, and if you have a look here, right above the sign Milano's, this portion of the building is kind of the main area where we were sitting. Very large dining hall. I think generally speaking, the reports coming back were very positive. There was a kind of a dance atmosphere, people dancing and enjoying themselves. As you moved a bit further along into the building, where my pointer is, things there was a bit more of a negative energy people were reporting. And I think there's a couple of mediums who actually picked up that one particular room, Joyce, that you mentioned about the girl having a bad experience. Quite a few of them had picked up on that independently, which was interesting. I think even for me, when I walked into that room, I actually felt something, and I usually don't feel anything. I'm not particularly sensitive to these things. So even I felt a little bit odd walking into that particular room. But in terms of the overall experience, I think for me, that's the next one. That was the big one for me. I should also mention that, Joyce, did you want to mention Sarah Krasnostein, the book?
Oh, yes. So Sarah was one of the people who came to that night, and she wrote a book about investigating the investigation. So if you want to read about it, and Vlad and Rob are featured in the book. She writes quite beautifully, and that was interesting. I just want to also mention that in Milano's there was a silver site there in 1893, but also interestingly, I found the staff there to be very grumpy, and I've been there a few times and they all seem pretty grumpy. And I do wonder if it's a haunted house with grumpy ghosts, whether that affects people's moods. So that was Milano's Tavern. Right, so the next place we investigated is called Mount Martha, and it's now a community centre, but it was built in around 1889. It was called the Mount Martha Coffee Palace, so people would go there for coffee instead of beer. And then it became a RAF training school in 1979, and I think some of the female trainees would stay there. There's a few interesting stories that came out of that, including some naughtiness going on in there. This is an interesting place. It has multiple rooms. It's actually very beautiful. It's got the lovely, I don't know what, Queen Anne style, or I don't know what the architecture style it is, but yeah, it's got lots and lots of rooms in it. So we could explore different rooms, and we did break up into small little groups and explore. We had quite a few psychic mediums as well. I was following one of the psychic medium. She picked up a little boy, and yeah, and the boy, she was speaking to the boy, and the boy was being looked after by another female ghost and a male caretaker of that place. And she asked if the boy wanted to go to the light. So seeing the light as in a portal opening where, you know, once you die, we usually go to the light and pass on, but some don't, and some get stuck in between the physical life and wherever we go after we die. And the boy said he wanted to go and join his parents. This is what the psychic medium said, as I record it. But the lady looking after the boy and the man wanted to hang on to the boy and didn't want him to go, but in the end they agreed. So there seems to be quite a bit of negotiation. And I actually noticed that when I was doing the course with Rob at that school, there was a lot of counselling going, as in to try and help I don't want to say convince, but help the ghosts, for want of a better word, to move on and not to be afraid to move on. Often they are very attached to that place or the people. Okay, so when she pointed out to the light and asked the boy to go through, the thing that I noticed the most were the emotions. I was overwhelmed. Like, it was like a surge of emotion. I wasn't even thinking about it, of real, like a sweet sadness, like, oh, wow. It was a happy sadness. Yeah, we were all feeling it once the boy went to the light. Oh. Yeah, so that was a very interesting experience for me. We went upstairs as well, and there was a room which was called the train room. I think inside there was a model train. I don't know, but we were there for a while, and the mediums were describing a lady in puffy, in a, you know, the olden day dress with the puffy shoulders and ribbons, and she couldn't breathe, and she was very, very confused. She was very, very sick. She thought she was coming here for a holiday, but she felt very, very sick. And then the man who was the caretaker, you know, he was locking up, and he came, and he when we described what we saw to him, he said he saw her as well, like often when he was locking up the place. Yeah, so, okay. But the main event happened towards the end of the investigation.
The way we actually came across this location was through the security groups. And I think the caretaker that you were referring to, that was actually the security guy. And he told us that quite a few of the security team refused to go into that location after hours, mainly because they've encountered so many unusual experiences, including full-blown apparitions of ladies in period costume and so on. So I think that's kind of how it got its kind of reputation. And certainly I've done a few investigations in there, and there's definitely something going on. I would love to have objective data, but unfortunately there's a lot of the experience that we had, which Joyce will probably start talking about. It was subjective. It was observed by 5 or 6 individuals, and it was an interesting observation.
Yeah.
I think there were five direct witnesses to the apparition. Yeah.
Oh, to the apparition. Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add, yeah, quite a few people saw, especially in the main room, a lot of hospital beds. So maybe there was some sort of outbreak or something, and that place was used to house sick people. Oh, and I also talked to the staff prior to the investigation, and they, yeah, again, they did say they experienced things. They've seen things disappear and reappear, things moving, furniture moving. Especially a couple of ladies, they seem quite attached to the ghosts as well, and they also said, "You're not going to get rid of them, are you?" I said, no. Yeah, so they, again, that kind of I don't know, relationship with the ghosts there. And also she said to me, "Are you going to ask the ghost permission for you to do this investigation?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I guess so." So yeah, in my mind, I asked them permission, and it was interesting. I felt this cobwebby feeling on my face when I asked permission. Yeah, okay. So at the end of the night, we sat in a circle in one of the main rooms, and we put some trigger objects out.
They're simple devices, and essentially anything that can be used for the entities to interact with, to give an indication that they are interacting with you. So the trigger toys, the trigger objects that I like, are essentially the little rubber or plastic balls, dog toys, for example, that when you bounce them, they light up, little lights start flashing. I like to put them around different locations on the floors and things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we put one near the kitchen, and yeah, also that kitchen, I didn't like the feeling. I didn't like going in there. But anyway, there was a trigger board near the kitchen. We put a bottle, a water bottle in the middle of the room. One of the psychic mediums said they saw a lady trying to push the bottle over, but she couldn't gather enough energy. Anyway, so we were trying to maybe drum up some energy to connect with the ghosts, and we started out off singing songs. That didn't work, and then we started singing songs maybe in their period, like Waltzing Matilda, or what we could think of. Nothing happened. And then one of the participants started telling us about an experience she had of a parallel life where she was married to someone else, and it was very vivid for her. Like, it was a very vivid dream state that she had of another time and place. And then she, when it was time for her to go, and she knew that, you know, she had to leave her husband in this parallel life, she was quite teary, and yeah, we were all so engrossed in her story, and we felt, I guess, the feelings when she was describing it. And then that was when the trigger object went off.
I think if you take a slightly bigger picture of the situation, a little bit of backstory with myself. Whenever I do investigations, it was done with groups that were essentially science-based. So they weren't particular. We try to avoid using mediums and psychics and so on, which in retrospect is not a great idea. But whenever we would do investigations, we would sit in a very controlled environment, and we would either talk to the room to say, "Hey, give us a sign," or we would just talk amongst ourselves and see if we could pick up any activity in the room. And we would often find that nothing would really happen until we take a break. So when we weren't focusing directly on the room or on the energy or interacting with these entities, when we weren't thinking about it, that's when something would happen. If we take a coffee break, all of a sudden something would happen. Or if we set up equipment in one part of the room, something would happen in a different room. So it's almost as if I've kind of felt like things were avoiding us. Either that, or perhaps the fact that we were being so vigilant and so intensely thinking about the activity that somehow that was actually hindering potentially. And this particular instance is different in that In this particular case, there were a whole bunch of us sitting around in circle, as Joyce mentioned, and we were trying to get a group energy through singing or doing similar things to try and raise our own thoughts, synchronize them, or raise the energy of the group. And again, that wasn't really working. People were a little bit reluctant. People were hesitant to sing because people don't have great singing voices. So there was a bit of hesitation. It wasn't until this one lady, Joyce, your friend, she shared a really deeply emotional story, and it grabbed everyone, even myself. Everybody felt really connected to this story. And I think it was this connection, this emotional connection, that either gave the room energy or synchronized or distracted people enough that all of a sudden we got this massive, probably the most significant event that I've come across in my time researching, where about 5 or 6 of us witnessed this apparition. I'm not sure apparition is the correct word, but it was essentially a distortion. It was almost like a shimmer, like a figure made up of light waves or shimmering run past through the room. The closest thing I can think of is if you watch the movie Predator in the jungle, and the alien or the predator has got this invisibility cloak, and when it runs through the jungle, it just has this shimmer effect. That's pretty close to what we saw. And there are about 5 of us who saw it. And then several seconds later, the trigger object went off, just started flashing by itself. And that was the exact direction that this thing was moving in. And at the same time, or in very, very close proximity, one of the mediums in the room, Cherie Francis, she's I've done quite a bit of work with her since. She's probably the first person who's actually convinced me about mediumship being genuine. She picked up on something because she literally screamed in, I'm not sure if it was fear or just angst or something, but something really, really hit her hard. And she also reacted. It took a little bit of time for her to actually calm down. But that's definitely out of character for her. That's the only time I've seen her do that in 3 or 4 years. Yeah. Mm. So it was just a case of perfect timing and perfect mental state. But this was the one instance where I thought, hang on, you can't be a passive observer. There's got to be an observer interaction with whatever's going on. And I think Brian, in one of his slides, he actually said, warning, it's a contact sport. That whoever's in the room is interacting with whatever the entity is, and that's when I realised, you know what? Perhaps there's some sort of energy, or perhaps your consciousness, or some aspect of the people in the room is either contributing to the energy in the room, or allowing. I'm not entirely sure. I still haven't quite figured it out, but something's going on, I think. And the third investigation that we'll talk about in a minute, I think, kind of confirms that for me a little bit more.
Mm.
Yeah.
And 3 of the men, just before the trigger went off, saw a shimmering in the windows as well.
Mm.
And then Cherie, the trigger object went off. So the trigger object was a cat. It's like a cat toy, and you have to shake it for it to flash. And nobody was touching it, obviously. Cherie was very emotional and started crying, and another psychic medium was teary as well. And they also talked about seeing this woman who lost her child, like a apparition of a woman who lost a child. So that was very interesting. Okay, so on to the next place. Okay, now this is a very interesting place, and without
it's not great to look at.
No.
But the image that you see there, the front entrance is in the middle where it says Masonic Hall. And in essence, it's just 2 large halls, one on the right in this direction here. And this is the Masonic portion itself. And then on the left, we have just a generic hall which can be hired out for various functions and things.
So it's where the Freemasons, they do their meetings. So there was a lot of, a certain room had a lot of different paraphernalia. So it was very interesting. We started off in the big hall, and I felt like the hall had a lot of activity, and we had another couple of people who brought a whole lot of toys, paranormal investigation toys, and some of the toys are quite interesting. Yep.
Joyce, I was just going to say that this photo here shows a previous investigation with my group. This is the actual Masonic hall proper that you would walk in for the Masonic ceremonies. If you from the perspective of the camera now, if you turn around, look backwards, that's a view of the corridor which walks to the other hall. Then the other hall is essentially where we did a large part of the investigation on this particular night. I'm not sure if I actually have. No, I don't. The toys that Joyce was talking about, this was another group that joined us for the investigation, and they loved all their different toys. So you can see here on the floor, so EMF meters and REM pods and ultrasound detectors.
That's a sound, yeah. That looks like a little coffin, and you'll play music when it detects some movement. So it's a bit like, you know, the horror movies. It's like the musical box. All of those things were going off. It was just going off in that room. There was so much energy, and so we were like walking around. Things were beeping, and often they don't. Like often it's quite. Often they would remain dormant without lights and sounds, but it was going off.
You have to be, sorry, I really, it kind of irks me a little bit, because under uncontrolled conditions, anything could be causing these things. So if people had their mobile phones in their pockets, the mobile phone, as it's looking for reception, that's been known to trigger magnetic field meters. So there's lots of potential explanations. It'd be a lot more credible if it was under tightly controlled conditions. But
so
for entertainment purposes.
This is more of an experiential thing rather than a scientific thing. So people go there to experience it, and people love it. They just love. We always sell out.
Joyce, I should point out that the video, I've got a video which I think is in the next slide.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Which kind of which shows a little bit of evidence to support my idea about this consciousness, the interaction effect that I was talking about. So the investigation itself for the night involved just groups of people, either in the Masonic hall or in the other hall. I'm not sure if I can see it there. This is a black and white image from one of my security cameras. This is the other hall where a lot of us were sitting. And I think for me, probably the most important part of the night was actually at the very beginning this time around. And this is where we're all sitting around in a circle at the very beginning doing a meditation, to try, everybody try to get into the right mindset, get meditation. And again, I think Joyce and Cherie are kind of just sitting off center here, and Cherie's just running people through a guided meditation. And it's at this point that one of my trigger objects, about 30 seconds in, the trigger object just decided to activate by itself. And this is probably the first time I've managed to get it on camera, because every other time it always happens where the camera is not looking. So I'll just play this. If you give me a second,
All right. While you look, I'll Then we went into the other room where you see the checkered board on the floor, and it was a very different feeling. It went flat. It was almost like the energy went really flat and not much was happening. I think because everybody was very focused on these toys that these other investigators brought, and it kind of took away from, really sensing, using our bodies to sense the energy of the room. It was interesting. After the investigation, I met someone who told me that he used to belong to some sort of experiential religious group, and they used to do a lot of ceremonies in that main hall and not so much in the Masonic room. Yeah, so just another many variables. Maybe a lot of energy was built up, and I know John was talking about energy in certain rooms.
The video itself isn't overly dramatic. It's people just sitting quietly in a circle, and then just off field, just to the right, the trigger object just decides to light up by itself. But I think for me, it kind of helped to reaffirm that idea that as people's attitudes or people's mental states change, that either affects the environment and allows whatever entities or some sort of anomalies to actually come through. And I haven't quite figured out if it's a case of a conscious entity, a spirit or something in the place, using the energy of the observers and feeding off that energy to manifest some sort of interaction with the environment, or if it's a case of the group focus moving away from this anomaly or this entity that's in the place, and that actually gives it a bit of breathing space, and that allows it to interact with the environment. So I haven't quite decided how it's important, but I can't help but feel that there's an important element to the conscious aspects of the observer itself. Joyce, how are you going?
Yeah, no, I can't find it.
Okay.
No worries. So yeah, just to wrap it up for me, I mean, I guess my beliefs might influence my experiences, like what Brian was talking about. I do believe in life after death, and I do believe that there are entities that might be stuck or lingering, and that's my belief. Yeah, also I think even though this is entertaining, it can also be quite dangerous, just from some people that I've talked to who used to experiment with this sort of stuff, and if they don't know what they're doing, get into all sorts of problems, especially using the Ouija board. For me, it's very interesting. Like if people encounter ghosts and see a psychic medium bring them to the light, there doesn't seem to be much different to what I normally would do, which is counseling clients and reassuring them and communicating to them. Maybe they're better off going off to the light. So obviously, yeah, this is kind of personal, subjective, experiential experiences, and and I think because this is quite interesting. Like this is quite a worldwide fascination and experience, and I still think we need more research, like with Brian's research and other research, John's research into these paranormal experiences. Did you want to wrap up, Vlad?
These are three very personal experiences, I think, Joyce. None of these three things are going to convince anyone in particular about the paranormal. You need more objective kind of evaluation, as Brian's trying to do, as some of the research that I've put together and published to do with environmental factors, things like moon phase and magnetic fields. So certainly objective research is important. Intellectual kind of evaluation of the phenomena is very important. I think these three investigations for myself have made me realise that approaching it from a purely intellectual perspective is not the be all and end all. It's strange as it is for a scientist to say that. There's certain almost spiritual element to this that needs to also be considered, and this is where my appreciation of using mediums and psychics to actually come into it, even though they're unknown entities in terms of a scientific perspective. It actually does help to give it a different perspective and a different direction to the research. Yeah.
We've got a question from Sandra. So she asked, Vlad, from a neuroscientist perspective, could you measure the neurological state of the person interacting?
We tried this several years ago. We tried using an ambulatory EEG setup. So we stick electrodes on the skull to record electrical activity of the brain as they're sensing entities, for example. It didn't work too well because these things are so prone to movement artifacts. And this particular medium, whenever she would sense something, her first instinct is to shake her head. And so every time that happened, we just had noise come through. So it wasn't particularly conducive to analysis. So we have tried it. We haven't actually tried it since. Something that may be worthwhile looking into, but it's not the easiest thing to do in a field investigation. Yeah. So I think I'm at the back there, turning the lights off. I'm going to skip forward because there we go. So here we turn the light off, and if you keep your eye to this bottom corner here.
Is it for?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really interesting how the psychics get involved. You, Joyce, were saying that there's two of the participants. Were they both psychics that said we need to ask the ghosts for permission? Were those psychics that said that to you, or just?
They were the workers. They were working at the community centre. Yeah,
well,
I don't know if they're psychic. They might be.
Yeah. Well, the point of my question is they had a relationship over time that is working with the ghosts. So
Yes.
I'm just curious if after your investigation, whether those workers would be able to be followed up and you could talk to them and say, hey, we've developed a ongoing dialogue or relationship or better understanding of where the ghosts were coming from.
Well, yeah, I did. I after the investigation, I jotted down all the, what the mediums describe, all the ghosts they saw. I described them all and I sent it to them, and they said, oh wow, that's what they saw too. They confirmed it, and they said, we'd love for you to come and tell us which room, where did you see them, but we didn't have time to do that.
But what I'm asking is something deeper, is the relationship between these participants and the ghosts may have really flowered, like how you develop a friendship. So to me, that's a very interesting question.
Very, yes.
Yeah. I think, Terry, I think you've made a very good point in that there is this idea that, well, first of all, it's polite if you treat these entities as regular human beings and you actually ask for permission to go into there, you announce yourself and say, hello, I'm coming to visit, and so on. It's just a nice gesture. But also someone put forward this idea that it might take a good three or 4 weeks before you get full activity occurring. I think there's even a documentary now looking at the 28-day theory, I think it is, of investigations, that if you do a single night's investigation, you won't get much. But if you stay there for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, 28 days, then that's when you actually get the full kind of the full spectrum of activity going on. Whatever's there becomes comfortable.
It's just very interesting that a relationship could develop, and I'm bringing now the psychics in, whether the psychics could later, some days later, pick up on dreams or reveries or impressions from those entities later. That's what I'm really curious about.
Right, okay, yeah. The closest I can get to that is I've had, Cherie has actually had a few things follow her home. So literally that night or the next day, she would realise, oh, something's actually affecting her dreams, or she's had 1 or 2 experiences where her children, her son, was actually seeing apparitions in the house, and that's when she would actually do a clearing and get rid of these entities in the house.
And you speak as if that might have been a problem for Cherie. To be followed home. Is that a problem for her per se?
It's not. I don't think it's a huge deal for her, but it's definitely not something that's encouraged. Yeah. I mean, usually you try to keep it in a location. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yep. Do you want to play?
Can you see the video now?
Yes.
All right. So the back of people, that's kind of the circle of people that we're looking at. It doesn't actually matter where I am. And off to the left here, to the left is where I think Cherie and Joyce is sitting. They're starting
that's me with the back.
this meditation. Oh, that's you there, is it?
I think so, yeah.
It may be.
Yeah.
And if you keep your eye on the right bottom, then you might just see the light going off. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. I spent so much time talking about it. It's underwhelming now, but for me, it's interesting because again, when the whole group was focusing on a particular idea, that's when something happened.
Was that one of your devices?
It's a little toy. It's a little toy ball.
You have to shake it for it to light up.
Yeah, it's a plastic ball, hollow, and inside is a little plastic light. And the way it's triggered is literally a spring. A spring will touch a metal contact, and that'll cause the lights to flicker for 10 seconds. The only way I've been able to induce it is by physical metal contact of the spring, or using a iron source, a really strong iron discharge, building up electrical potential that causes a short circuit, and that causes it to spark as well. Those are the only two ways that I could think of activating it.
Don, you got a question?
Yes. Okay. Let me try this. This is going to be, I'm not a ghost hunter and I have no experience in this, but there's a theory that I encountered that physical materials can have a sense of their own memory. Maybe they have a sense of consciousness or something right in the building materials, and ghosts might be simply the building's memory of something, people that were there or events that had occurred there. And I'm just wondering, as I'm watching your presentation, do you feel you were actually talking to spirit intelligences, or perhaps there was like some sort of minimal intellectual ability which indicated that they were maybe just, a vibrational memory in the environment? Do you have any feeling on this?
Look, I'm not psychic, I'm not sensitive. My interaction with the mediums, though, would suggest that there is a lot of intellectual, quite conscious entities who interact with people. Certainly, at least 2 out of the 3 locations were conscious entities. I have heard of locations where there's this residual energy in a particular building. And again, this may very well link back to the sacred spaces, where a energy of a particular event might have actually been imprinted in the location, and that's what people pick up on. But certainly, yeah, and entities that manifests in the buildings and in the rooms get picked up preferentially by the mediums who are more capable of detecting them.
In a couple of my investigations I was involved in, there was appearances of pools of water in an unexplained manner on the floor. In one case in association with a really hyped up person, which sort of lends credence to the idea that it's to do with the person themselves.
I have heard of these cases, but more to do with poltergeist activity.
Yes.
Where you get unexplained, literally a pool of water from the ceiling dripping down into the kitchen, and when you go try to find the source of the dripping, there is none. The plumber says, well, it's not coming from anywhere. And the curious thing was the plaster on the ceiling was actually dry, so it's almost as if the water was a few, like a micron below the plaster, just manifesting from nowhere.
Yes, typical poltergeist sort of stuff. Really quite fascinating. I'm more interested in those kind of physical effects.
Just make a general comment that Brian Lax was earlier saying, don't use those little handheld things, you know. You need to go over to Mesa 3 because you can get real-time recordings. Vlad, your microphone's off. You can get real-time recordings, which would, and some of the phenomena you were talking about suggested it would have been really good to have that real-time measure to see the ebbs and flows of whatever data you were collecting. And a lot of the other phenomena you were talking about are typical, like you only get them when you don't pay attention, and the more you want it, the less chance you've got of getting it. And that's a typical kind of report.
All right, so well, let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll have our next speaker, Douglas, so which I'm really looking forward to.